In 1978, amidst the stark frozen expanse of the Arctic, two brilliant minds pursued a phantom magnetic signal into oblivion. For 40 years the ice kept their secret, a silent, unforgiving tomb. Then a melting glacier gave up a frozen canister, its surface scratched with the beginning of an answer they died to tell. The air at Research Outpost Thule tasted of metal and impending ice. Dr. Alistair Finch braced against the wind, his gaze fixed on the grey horizon, where the sky and the endless ice sheet merged into one indistinct blur of fate. His partner, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, stood beside him, her expression a mask of focused determination that betrayed none of the inherent dread such a landscape inspired. They were about to lead their small, hand-picked team into a territory marked on their charts only by a question mark and a series of wildly fluctuating magnetic readings. The anomaly was a siren's call in the data, a scientific impossibility that demanded investigation, and they were the only ones equipped, and perhaps foolish enough to answer it. Their specialized snowcrawler, a lumbering beast of treads and insulated plating, was packed with the bleeding edge of 1978 technology. At its heart was the experimental magneto-resonance imager, a device of Alistair's own design, intended to map the subterranean world without drilling an inch. The final checks were a ritual performed with numb fingers and professional calm. Every strap was tightened, every fuel line inspected, every radio antenna tested for the faintest crackle of life that would be their only link to this world. The rest of their support crew watched from the relative warmth of the outpost's main dome, their faces pressed against the triple-paned plexiglass with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They knew, as Alistair and Evelyn knew, that the Arctic did not suffer mistakes gladly, and it never gave back what it claimed. Alistair clapped a gloved hand on the crawler's frozen hull, the sound a dull, absorbed thud in the thick air. This was the culmination of years of research, of grant proposals and academic battles, a gamble on a theory that most of their peers had dismissed as fantastical. Evelyn ran a final diagnostic on the imager's primary console, her movements precise and economical. She trusted the science, she trusted Alistair, but the Arctic was an entity unto itself, a variable that could not be accounted for in any equation. Their small team was comprised of the best, two seasoned Norwegian guides, brothers named Lars and Gunnar, whose faces were maps of past expeditions, and a young, eager geophysicist named Ben Carter, who saw this as the adventure of a lifetime. The five of them were a self-contained unit, a tiny bubble of human endeavor about to be cast adrift on a frozen ocean. The mission parameters were clear: travel 300 kilometers to the anomaly's epicenter, deploy the imager, gather the data, and return before the deep winter darkness swallowed the sun for good. It was a tight schedule, aggressive, but they had calculated, achievable. The anomaly's pull was too strong to ignore, a whisper of a fundamental discovery that could rewrite their understanding of planetary magnetic fields. Alistair gave the final nod to the outpost commander, a silent acknowledgement that the die was cast. The crawler's diesel engine roared to life, a violent man-made intrusion into the profound silence of the pole. The massive treads bit into the compressed snow, and the vehicle began its slow, inexorable crawl away from the last bastion of civilization they would see for weeks. Evelyn's voice, calm and steady, came over the internal comms, reporting initial system readings as perfectly nominal. Alistair watched the outpost shrink in his side mirror until it was just a tiny, insignificant dome against the overwhelming white. He felt the familiar thrill of the unknown, the intoxicating pull of a question that only the wilderness could answer. This was where he was most alive, at the very edge of the map, pushing into the blank spaces. The magnetic anomaly wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a personal obsession, a puzzle he had chased through reams of satellite data for years. Its signature was unlike anything he had ever seen, a rhythmic pulse in the Earth's magnetic field that seemed almost deliberate. Inside the cramped cabin, the team settled into the routines that would govern their lives. Ben monitored the long-range sensors, his eyes wide with the wonder of it all, while Lars and Gunnar navigated by instinct and compass, their conversation a low, reassuring murmur in their native tongue. Evelyn was already lost in her work, her fingers flying across the console, coaxing the first trickles of preliminary data from the array of sensors mounted on their hull. She cross-referenced the incoming magnetic fluctuations with their seismic and gravimetric readings, building a multi-layered picture of the world hidden beneath the ice. The landscape outside was a monotonous, hypnotic panorama of white and blue, a place of stark, brutal beauty that could lull you into a false sense of security. Every sastrugi, the wind-carved ridges in the snow, was a potential hazard, and every shift in the weather was a potential death sentence. They were utterly, completely on their own. Alistair took the first formal log entry, his voice steady despite the vibration of the engine. Day 1, expedition underway. All systems are green. Morale is high. He paused, looking at Evelyn, who gave him a slight, confident smile. He knew she shared his quiet exhilaration, the pure joy of the hunt. The Anomaly was out there, waiting for them, a ghost in the machine of the world. It was a secret hidden for millennia beneath a kilometer of ice, and they were closing in. The rhythmic clank of the treads was the only music, a percussive beat counting down the distance to their destination. The promise of discovery was a tangible thing, a warmth in the frigid cabin that had nothing to do with the heater. For now, the Arctic held them in a state of grace, allowing them passage, its true nature veiled by the calm of the initial journey. The real test, they knew, was yet to come. The first twist was still miles away, buried deep. The first week of radio check-ins went exactly as planned. Alistair's voice, transmitted across hundreds of kilometers of barren ice, was a beacon of professionalism and progress, reporting their steady advance and the flawless performance of their equipment. He described the breathtaking desolation of the polar plateau, the endless fields of wind-scoured snow, and the chillingly beautiful auroras that danced in the perpetual twilight. Evelyn would occasionally add a technical update, her words concise and packed with data, confirming that the initial magnetic readings were growing stronger, more defined, as they neared the target zone. The team at Thule would huddle around the communications console, listening to the dispatches from the void, their anxieties momentarily eased by the familiar voices of their colleagues. They tracked the crawler's position on a large topographical map, a single black pin moving deeper into the vast, unforgiving white. The mission was proceeding by the book, a textbook example of polar exploration. Then on day 8, the scheduled transmission was 5 minutes late, a minor delay, easily attributable to atmospheric interference or a momentary equipment glitch. Yet a knot of unease tightened in the stomachs of the comms team at the outpost. 10 minutes passed, then 20, the silence in the radio room growing heavier with each passing second. The operator sent out a standard call, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Thukel to Expedition Phoenix. Do you copy? Over. The only reply was the hiss of static, the sound of the universe's indifference. They tried again, on backup frequencies, boosting the signal, their actions becoming more urgent, more desperate. The static hissed back, a relentless, empty sound that seemed to mock their efforts. The silence from the Phoenix was absolute, a sudden and complete severance of their lifeline. The protocol for a missed communication was clear. They were to wait 12 hours before escalating the situation, to account for any number of non-critical issues that could disrupt a transmission. Those 12 hours were the longest in the outpost commander's memory. Every crew member felt the oppressive weight of the silence, the gnawing uncertainty that crept into every corner of the research station. They strained their ears, hoping to hear the distant, miraculous crackle of a restored signal. But the radio remained stubbornly, terrifyingly mute. The single black pin on the map now seemed less like a marker of progress and more like a tombstone. It sat motionless at the edge of the region they had designated the Anomaly Zone, a place that was now acquiring a sinister, malevolent character in their minds. The vibrant, exciting scientific venture had in the space of half a day transformed into a potential tragedy. After the 12-hour mark passed with no word, the outpost commander officially declared a communications blackout. The next step was to initiate a search, but a severe polar vortex had descended upon the region, a maelstrom of cyclonic winds and blinding snow that grounded all aerial assets. The storm, which had appeared on their long-range forecasts but had not been expected to be so violent, now seemed like an accomplice to the silence. It raged for 3 days, a physical manifestation of the Arctic's power to isolate and to kill. The team at Thule could do nothing but wait, trapped by the same weather that was likely battering the lost expedition, their helplessness a bitter pill to swallow. They imagined the crawler, a tiny metal shell against the fury of the elements, its occupants huddled inside, their hope dwindling with their power reserves. When the storm finally broke, the sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the air crisp and lethally cold. The silence from the Phoenix expedition, however, remained unbroken. The absence of a signal was no longer just a concern. It was a deafening roar of wrongness. Alistair Finch was a meticulous planner, a veteran of a dozen harsh environments. He would have had contingency plans, backup radios, emergency beacons. For all of them to fail simultaneously suggested a catastrophic event, something sudden and overwhelming that had given them no time to even send a distress call. The theories flew around the outpost, whispered in hushed, fearful tones. Had they broken through a hidden crevasse, plunging hundreds of feet into the ice? Had the experimental imager suffered a catastrophic power failure, leading to a fatal cascade of system shutdowns? Or had the anomaly itself, the strange magnetic phenomenon they had gone to study, played a role in their disappearance? This last possibility was never officially voiced, but it lingered in the air, a sliver of superstitious dread in the hearts of rational scientists. The mystery of their fate had begun, a story that would be told in whispers for decades to come, a cautionary tale of the secrets the ice preferred to keep. The frozen silence was complete. The moment the weather cleared, the search began. A Canadian Forces C-130 Hercules, diverted from its usual patrol route, was the first asset to arrive, its 4 turboprop engines, a roaring promise of hope against the crushing silence. From an altitude of 10,000 feet, the vast polar plateau was a canvas of deceptive serenity. The search grid was centered on the crawler's last known position, a precisely calculated point that now felt like the center of a void. The flight crew, equipped with high-resolution cameras and thermal imagers, scanned the endless expanse of white, their eyes straining for any sign of human activity, any dark shape that didn't belong to the natural landscape. They flew for hours, the drone of the engines a monotonous hum, as they crisscrossed the designated area. The landscape offered nothing. It was a world wiped clean, a pristine, featureless desert of ice that seemed to have swallowed the 5 explorers and their vehicle whole. On the ground, 2 specialized search and rescue teams were mobilized from Thule. They set out on agile, powerful snowmobiles, their faces wrapped in fleece and goggles against the biting wind. They were following the crawler's presumed path, a line on a map that represented the last known moments of the Phoenix expedition. The conditions were brutal. The temperature hovered around -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind chill made it feel colder still. Every piece of exposed skin was a liability, and every mechanical component on their machines was pushed to its breaking point. They found the tracks of the massive snow crawler, faint but still visible, etched into the wind-hardened snow. The tracks were a ghostly trail leading into the heart of the anomaly zone, a tangible link to the lost team that spurred the rescuers on. The trail continued for another 20 kilometers past the last known radio position, a testament to the crawler's robust design. Then, the tracks began to show signs of distress. They swerved sharply, cutting deep, erratic gouges into the ice, as if the driver had been fighting for control of the vehicle. Scattered across a 100-meter area was the first concrete evidence of a disaster. A spare fuel drum, empty, lay on its side, its metal skin buckled. A snapped tow cable, thick as a man's wrist, was half buried in a snowdrift, its frayed ends suggesting an immense, sudden force had torn it apart. The search team documented everything, their cameras clicking in the frigid air, their movements economical and grim. This was not the scene of a simple mechanical failure. This was the scene of a struggle. Further on, they found a single, solitary glove. It was Evelyn Hayes's, identified by a small, stitched polar bear emblem she was known for. It lay on the snow, palm up, as if reaching for a sky that offered no help. The discovery sent a chill through the search team that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was an intimate, personal object, a stark reminder of the human beings at the center of this unfolding tragedy. There was no sign of a body, no blood, nothing to explain how the glove had come to be there, alone, on the ice. The area was marked, the glove carefully bagged as evidence, and the search pushed onward, deeper into the unnerving silence of the anomaly zone. The team's initial hope began to curdle into a grim sense of forensics. They were no longer searching for survivors, they were searching for answers. The crawler itself was never found. The tracks simply stopped, not at the edge of a crevasse, not in a field of broken ice, but in the middle of a vast, flat, undisturbed plain of snow. It was as if the 10-ton vehicle and its 5 occupants had been plucked from the surface of the earth. The search team circled the area on foot, using ground-penetrating radar to scan the ice beneath them, hoping to find a hidden cavern or a fissure that could explain the vehicle's disappearance. The radar showed nothing but solid, ancient ice, hundreds of meters deep. The aerial search was expanded, then expanded again, covering thousands of square kilometers of identical, featureless terrain. They found nothing, no wreckage, no debris field, no final camp. The official report, filed months later, concluded that the Phoenix expedition was lost, presumed dead, its fate unknown. The Arctic had not just claimed them, it had erased them, leaving behind only a handful of scattered clues and a profound, unsettling mystery that would endure for generations. The search was over, but the questions had only just begun. In 2018, the Arctic was a different world. The relentless rise in global temperatures was doing what no search team ever could. It was forcing the ice to give up its dead. The Great Helheim Glacier, a colossal river of ice on the eastern coast of Greenland, was in a state of catastrophic retreat, carving icebergs the size of cities and bleeding meltwater into the North Atlantic. For decades, it had been an object of scientific study, but now it was also becoming an archive, a repository of things lost to time, slowly emerging from their frozen tombs. It was a glaciologist from a Danish survey team, mapping the glacier's unprecedented melt, who found it. He was checking a remote sensor station when a glint of reflected sunlight caught his eye, something out of place against the brilliant blue and white of the glacial ice. It was a man-made object, a dull grey metal, held fast in a newly exposed wall of ancient compressed ice, about 50 meters from the glacier's crumbling edge. The object was a canister, roughly a meter long, its surface scoured and pitted by the immense pressure of the ice that had held it captive for 40 years. But it was the marks on its surface that made the glaciologist's heart hammer against his ribs. They were not random scratches, they were letters, crudely etched into the metal with a sharp object, a desperate, final act of communication. He could make out the universal signal of distress, SOS, followed by 2 names that were legendary in the annals of polar exploration, Finch and Hayes. The glaciologist felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo, as if the past had reached out and grabbed him. The lost Phoenix expedition was not just a story from old journals. It was here, frozen in time, its final message locked in the ice before him. He immediately understood the magnitude of the discovery. The rest of the inscription was partially obscured by a thick lens of refrozen meltwater that clung to the canister's body. Through the distortion of the ice, he could just make out more words. He chipped away at the surface ice with the handle of his ice axe, his movements careful and reverent. The letters were faint, scratched with what looked like a trembling hand. Anomaly is the final word, or words were completely encased in the deepest part of the ice. A frozen secret, tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. The sentence was a cliffhanger written by the dead, a chilling fragment that hinted at a truth far stranger than anyone had ever imagined. The canister wasn't just debris, it was a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of ice 4 decades ago, and it had finally found its shore. This was the first major twist in a story everyone thought had ended in silent tragedy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the international scientific community. The mystery of the Phoenix expedition, long relegated to the status of a cold case, was suddenly, explosively active. The Danish government, in cooperation with Canadian and American polar research agencies, immediately cordoned off the site. The news reached Dr. Lena Hansen at her university office, where she was contemplating a quiet retirement after a long and distinguished career in Arctic geophysics. The names Finch and Hayes struck her with the force of a physical blow. Their disappearance had been the formative event of her early career, the ghost story that had both inspired and haunted her, the very reason she had dedicated her life to studying the unforgiving power of the ice. The whispers of their lost expedition, of the strange magnetic anomaly they were chasing, had been the catalyst for her own life's work. Lena, now in her late 60s, felt a surge of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was personal. She had spent a lifetime walking in the footsteps of Alistair Finch and Evelyn Hayes, using technologies they could only have dreamed of to study the very phenomena that had led them to their doom. She knew their research papers by heart, had mentally rehearsed the logic of their final expedition 1,000 times. She immediately contacted the head of the Polar Research Institute, her voice steady but firm, offering her expertise. She was the world's foremost authority on subglacial magnetic phenomena, and more than that, she was the institutional memory of the Phoenix mystery. There was no one on Earth better suited to unlock the secrets held within that frozen canister. The ice had revealed its first clue, and for Lena Hansen, a lifelong puzzle was finally demanding to be solved. Her retirement would have to wait. The ghosts of the Arctic were calling. The journey to Greenland was a blur of frantic preparations and professional consultations. Dr. Lena Hansen arrived at the secure facility near Kangerlussuaq, a state-of-the-art laboratory hastily repurposed for one of the most delicate archaeological tasks in modern history. The canister, encased in its massive block of glacial ice, had been airlifted from the Helheim site with the care afforded to a holy relic. It now sat in the center of a cold, sterile room, a sarcophagus of ice under the watchful eyes of Lena and a small elite team of cryo-specialists and forensic archivists. The air in the lab was kept at a precise -20 degrees Celsius, a temperature that protected the integrity of the ice block while allowing the team to work. Lena felt the weight of 40 years of silence pressing down on her as she looked at the frozen tomb. She was about to become the first person to read a message from the dead. The thawing process was an exercise in agonizing patience. They couldn't simply apply heat. That would risk thermal shock, potentially destroying whatever fragile contents were inside the canister. Instead, they used a system of low-energy microwave emitters, calibrated to melt the ice layer by microscopic layer, a process that would take days. Lena watched the monitors, her gaze locked on the thermal imaging display that showed the slow, methodical retreat of the ice from the metal cylinder. Every tick of the clock felt like a heartbeat, counting down to a revelation that could be either enlightening or devastating. She spent the long hours reviewing Finch's and Hayes' original mission proposal, cross-referencing their stated goals with the canister's discovery location. The Glacier had carried it hundreds of kilometers from the Anomaly zone, a slow, inexorable journey that had preserved it for this very moment. As the last layers of ice finally slowed away, the full inscription on the canister became visible. SOS Finch and Hayes Anomaly is not geological. The final words, stark and unambiguous, hung in the frigid air of the lab. Not geological. Lena felt a chill that was colder than the room around her. Finch was a geophysicist. For him to state that the anomaly, the entire focus of his life's work and his final expedition, was not a natural feature of the Earth, was a seismic revelation. It invalidated every accepted theory about their disappearance. It pointed to something else entirely, something artificial, something that had no place being buried under a kilometer of polar ice. The team fell silent, the implications of that short, desperate sentence sinking in. They were no longer just investigating a tragic accident. They were on the trail of a discovery of profound and perhaps terrifying significance. With the exterior documented, the delicate process of opening the canister began. A specialized robotic arm, guided by a technician, drilled through the canister's end cap with surgical precision. A hiss of escaping air confirmed that the container had held its seal for 4 decades, a small miracle of 1970s engineering. Inside, packed in what was once insulating foam, now degraded and waterlogged, were 2 items. The first was a series of geological samples, rocks and ice cores, each carefully bagged and labeled. The second, and most precious, was a standard issue expedition logbook, its cover warped and its pages swollen with moisture, but miraculously not turned to pulp. It was Alistair Finch's logbook. Lena felt an almost unbearable sense of reverence as a technician, using specially designed soft grip tools, lifted the sodden book from its tomb. The logbook was immediately placed in a vacuum freezer to sublimate the ice crystals within the paper. a painstaking process to render the pages stable enough to be handled. While that slow, careful work proceeded, Lena turned her attention to the geological samples. Under a microscope, the rock fragments showed nothing unusual, typical metamorphic schists common to Greenland's subglacial geology. But when her team subjected them to spectrometry and magnetic resonance analysis, the results were anything but typical. The samples pulsed with a faint but persistent energy signature, a low-level electromagnetic radiation that the lab's equipment struggled to classify. It was a frequency she had never encountered, one that didn't match any known natural radioactive decay or mineral resonance. It was as if these inert rocks had been charged by an external source, imbued with a strange energy from the anomaly itself. The logbook held the narrative, but these rocks held the physical proof. The past was not just being thawed, it was being re-energized. With the logbook still undergoing its delicate preservation process, Lena Hansen threw herself into the data they already possessed. She assembled a team of geophysicists and data analysts, turning the lab into a command center for a digital archaeological dig. Their primary goal was to take the fragmented 40-year-old data from Finch and Hayes' last known transmissions and combine it with the new information gleaned from the canister's discovery location and the strange energy signature of the rock samples. They were attempting to build a complete modern map of a phenomenon that had only been a ghostly whisper in 1978. Lena felt a kinship with Evelyn Hayes, imagining her hunched over a primitive console, trying to make sense of the same bizarre readings that were now being processed by supercomputers. The first step was to reanalyze Finch and Hayes' last recorded coordinates. Using advanced glaciological models, Lena's team was able to accurately chart the movement of the ice over the past 40 years. They could effectively rewind the Helheim Glacier's flow, tracing the canister's long, slow journey from the interior to the coast. This allowed them to pinpoint the exact location where the canister must have entered the ice with a margin of error of less than a square kilometer. The result was breathtaking. The location was deep in the polar interior, a region still largely unexplored, and it lined up perfectly with the epicenter of the magnetic fluctuations that Alistair Finch had first identified decades ago. For the first time, they had a precise physical location for the heart of the anomaly. The next phase of the analysis involved the logbook. The forensic archivists had managed to stabilize the first dozen pages, enough to give Lena a glimpse into the expedition's final days. The early entries were routine, filled with technical observations and professional enthusiasm. But as the Phoenix crawler drew closer to the anomaly, the tone of Alistair's writing began to shift. He described magnetic readings that were beautifully, impossibly coherent, and seismic data that suggested a void or chamber of unusual regularity beneath the ice. Evelyn Hayes had apparently hypothesized that they were seeing a unique form of crystalline geological structure, but Alistair, in his notes, seemed to be leaning towards a more radical, and as yet unstated, conclusion. These precious few pages, combined with the hard coordinates, gave Lena the parameters she needed for the next step. Armed with a precise location and the specific magnetic frequencies recorded in the logbook, and radiating from the rock samples, Lena tasked her team with a complete deep scan analysis of the target zone. They requisitioned time on a powerful satellite, equipped with the latest generation of ground-penetrating radar and magnetic anomaly detectors. It was the modern equivalent of Finch's custom-built imager, but infinitely more powerful. As the satellite passed over the coordinates, it bombarded the 2-kilometer-thick ice sheet with specialized waves, listening for the echoes that would paint a picture of the subglacial world. The first raw data streams began to flood the lab's servers, appearing on the main screen as a complex, chaotic mess of signals and noise. The team worked feverishly, applying filtering algorithms and cross-referencing the signals with known geological signatures. Slowly, a clear image began to emerge from the static. The anomaly was not a diffuse magnetic field, as had been long assumed. It was highly localized, emanating from a single, distinct point deep beneath the ice. The data confirmed Finch's early notes. The anomaly was located within a massive subglacial feature. The satellite's radar revealed a vast cavern-like structure, but its shape was what made Lena's blood run cold. Natural subglacial lakes and caverns were irregular, sculpted by the slow, chaotic forces of meltwater and pressure. This feature was different. It displayed unsettlingly regular patterns, hints of straight lines and sweeping, perfect arcs that seemed to defy natural formation. The fluctuating magnetic fields, the same ones that had lured Finch and Hayes to their deaths, pulsed rhythmically from the very center of this hidden space. The map was complete. They had found the monster's lair, but they still had no idea what the monster was. The satellite data was both a monumental breakthrough and a terrifying new puzzle. A map was no longer enough. Lena Hansen knew, with absolute certainty, that they had to see what was down there. The political and logistical hurdles were immense, but the implications of the discovery, an unknown source of immense energy and a potentially artificial structure buried under 2 kilometers of polar ice, were too significant to ignore. A consortium of international research agencies, spurred by Lena's relentless advocacy and the undeniable evidence, fast-tracked the most audacious polar mission in a generation. They would not be sending a human team. The risks were too great, the environment too hostile. Instead, they would deploy a state-of-the-art robotic probe, an unmanned submersible designed for the crushing pressures and lethal cold of subglacial exploration. The probe, named Orpheus, was a marvel of modern engineering. A sleek, torpedo-shaped vehicle, bristling with an array of sensors, cameras, and drills. It was designed to be lowered down a moulin, a vertical shaft carved through the glacier by meltwater, and then navigate the network of subglacial tunnels toward the target. Lena oversaw every aspect of the probe's final preparations, a constant, driving presence in the engineering bay. She insisted on a specific suite of sensors, a high-resolution sonar mapper, an enhanced magnetometer, a spectrometer to analyze water composition, and most importantly, a series of ultra-high-definition cameras that would be their eyes in the abyss. She felt the ghosts of Finch and Hayes watching her, and she was determined to succeed where they had failed, to see what they had only been able to glimpse in their data. The deployment took place from a temporary ice camp, a cluster of insulated modules established at the coordinates pinpointed by the satellite. The location was one of the most remote and inhospitable places on the planet. The team worked under the perpetual twilight of the Arctic autumn, the wind a constant, keening presence. The chosen moulin was a terrifying sight, a nearly perfectly circular hole in the ice that plunged into blackness. The roar of meltwater rushing into its depths was a constant reminder of the violent, dynamic world hidden beneath their feet. The Orpheus probe was carefully lowered by a heavy-duty crane, its fiber-optic tether, their only link to the machine, spooling out behind it like a silver thread. Lena stood at the console in the command module, her eyes fixed on the primary camera feed. The screen showed the textured blue-white walls of the ice shaft rushing past as the probe began its descent into the underworld. The first 1,000 meters of the descent were a tense but straightforward journey through the vertical shaft. Then the probe reached the base of the glacier, entering a realm of unimaginable pressure and darkness. The camera feed showed a world that no human had ever seen directly, the interface between the ancient ice sheet and the bedrock of Greenland. The probe's powerful lights cut through the absolute black, revealing a chaotic network of channels carved by the flow of meltwater. As instructed by the pre-programmed navigation system, guided by the sonar map from the satellite, Orpheus oriented itself and began to move through the largest of the tunnels, its thrusters whirring silently in the crushing dark. The data streams began to flow back to the command module. The water temperature was a stable, near-freezing 0.1 degrees Celsius. The pressure was immense, over 200 times that of the surface. As the probe moved closer to the anomaly's source, the readings from the magnetometer began to climb exponentially. The rhythmic pulse that Finch had detected with his 1970s equipment was now a deafening roar in the probe's sensors. The electromagnetic activity was so intense that it began to interfere with some of the probe's secondary systems, causing momentary flickers in the video feed. The technicians monitored the probe's status with anxious focus, but Lena was transfixed by the magnetometer display. The fluctuations were not random. They were patterned, complex, almost like a language. It was a structured, repeating signal of immense power, emanating from the vast cavern they were now approaching. The water's spectrometer readings also began to change, showing trace amounts of exotic non-terrestrial isotopes, elements that had no business being in glacial meltwater. The probe was sending back evidence of a phenomenon that was fundamentally alien to the known laws of geology and physics. It was swimming toward the heart of the anomaly, and the unsettling readings were a clear warning that whatever they were about to find, it was not of this Earth. The Orpheus probe pushed through the final narrow channel and emerged into the vast cavern pinpointed by the satellite scans. The probe's floodlights, powerful as they were, struggled to penetrate the immense darkness, their beams diffusing into the inky blackness of the subglacial void. The primary camera feed showed nothing but an endless expanse of dark water. It was the sonar imaging system that would be their true eyes in this abyss. In the command module, Lena Hansen leaned closer to the sonar display, her heart pounding in time with the rhythmic pings being sent out by the probe. The first returns were just beginning to paint a picture of their surroundings, building a three-dimensional map line by excruciating line. The cavern was even larger than the satellite data had suggested, a colossal subglacial dome that could have comfortably housed a major city. The initial sonar readings showed the rough, irregular ceiling of ice far above and the uneven bedrock below, but as the probe moved deeper into the cavern, toward the epicenter of the magnetic pulses, the sonar began to map something that made the entire command team fall into a stunned silence. Rising from the center of the cavern floor was the source of the anomaly. It was not a natural geological formation, it was a structure. The sonar display, cold and clinical, rendered its shape with undeniable precision. It was a massive, perfectly symmetrical object, a flattened disc or pyramid, its geometric regularity a stark, shocking contrast to the chaotic natural world around it. The structure was immense, at least a kilometer in diameter, its surface composed of impossibly straight lines and perfectly defined angles. There were no signs of erosion, no geological imperfections. It was a thing of design, of intention. The material it was made of defied easy analysis. The probe's limited material scanner, designed to identify rock types, returned a string of errors. The object's composition did not match any known mineral or alloy. It absorbed the probe's scanning frequencies in a way that suggested a substance of incredible density and complexity. This was the second major twist, a revelation that shattered the very foundations of Lena's scientific understanding. Finch's final cryptic message on the canister, "Anomaly is not geological," was a profound understatement. It was architecture. Lena ordered the probe to descend, to move closer, to give them a visual. The Orpheus maneuvered cautiously, its lights now pointed directly at the colossal object below. The camera feed flickered with electromagnetic interference, the anomaly's intense energy field playing havoc with the electronics. Then, through the static, they saw it. The floodlights slid across a surface, unlike anything Lena had ever seen. It was a dark metallic material, almost black, but it didn't reflect the light so much as swallow it. The surface was not smooth. It was covered in a complex pattern of geometric etchings, vast, interlocking lines and shapes that formed a continuous, intricate pattern across its entire visible face. The scale was breathtaking. A single one of the etched lines was wider than the probe itself. This was a discovery beyond comprehension, a paradigm-shifting revelation that recontextualized everything. The disappearance of Finch and Hayes was no longer a simple polar tragedy. They hadn't just stumbled upon a strange magnetic field. They had found this. They had stood at the edge of this same precipice of understanding, and it had consumed them. The structure pulsed with energy, the rhythmic magnetic field it generated, washing over the Orpheus probe in waves. It felt ancient, dormant, but not dead. It was the source of the exotic isotopes in the water, the source of the energy that had charged the rocks in the canister, the source of the mystery that had haunted Lena for her entire adult life. The sonar had revealed the truth, but the truth was an impossibility. Buried for an unknown number of eons, beneath 2 kilometers of Greenland's ice sheet, was a colossal, non-human artifact of unknown origin and purpose. The Arctic had not just hidden a secret, it had guarded a visitor. The discovery of the subglacial structure threw the entire operation into a state of controlled chaos and profound awe. While the engineers and technicians worked to stabilize the Orpheus probe's systems against the overwhelming energy field, Lena Hansen retreated to the quiet of the archiving module. The rest of Alistair Finch's logbook had finally been rendered stable, its waterlogged pages carefully separated and digitized. With the impossible image of the buried artifact burned into her mind, she now had to read the final testament of the man who had discovered it 40 years before her. She sat at a terminal, the scanned pages of the logbook displayed on the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she navigated to the last dated entry. The handwriting in the final pages was a stark departure from the neat professional script of the earlier entries. The words were slanted, written with a hurried, almost frantic pressure. The language had lost its detached scientific tone, replaced by a raw mixture of terror and wonder. Alistair described the final approach to the anomaly, the way their instruments began to behave erratically, the readings going off the scale. He wrote of a low, resonant hum that wasn't audible, but that they could all feel in their bones, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ice beneath them. He documented Evelyn's growing concern, her insistence that they were dealing with a phenomenon that was actively influencing their equipment in ways that defied physics. Then came the entry from the day before their final aborted radio transmission. Alistair described how the crawler's primary drill, which they had been using to take ice core samples, had suddenly and catastrophically failed. It hadn't just broken, it had shattered, the hardened tungsten carbide bit turning to shrapnel, as if it had struck something impossibly hard just a few meters beneath them. That was when they knew they were directly on top of something, not just a magnetic field, but a solid physical object of immense size buried under the ice. Alistair wrote of the overwhelming sense of being watched, a feeling that he dismissed as paranoia, but which all 5 members of the team had confessed to experiencing. The anomaly was no longer a passive subject of study, it felt like an intelligence. The final legible entry in the logbook was dated just hours before their last scheduled contact with Thule. The page was stained with what looked like melted snow, the ink slightly blurred, as if written in great haste. Lena read the words, her breath catching in her throat. Evelyn was right. Alistair wrote, "It's not a signal, it's a voice, a pressure in the mind. It shows us things, images, geometries, that hurt to look at. We all feel it now. The influence is growing stronger." The word influence sent a jolt of ice through Lena's veins. It was not a scientific term. It was a word of fear, of a loss of control. Finch, the rational scientist, was describing something akin to a psychic or psychological assault. The entry continued, each word heavier with dread than the last. "We made a discovery beyond comprehension. It's not a rock, not a formation. It's a machine, a tomb. We don't know, but we know we have awakened something that should have slept forever." The final sentence of the logbook, the last words Alistair Finch ever wrote, were scrawled at the bottom of the page, the pen having dug deep into the paper. "The ice is the only thing keeping it contained. We cannot let it out. Hayes is trying to create a warning, something that will last." Lena stared at the screen, the words burning into her memory. The canister, the SOS. It wasn't just a call for help, it was a warning to the future. Finch and Hayes hadn't died trying to escape. They had died trying to ensure no one else made the same mistake. A final, desperate act to protect the world from their own discovery. The fear he described, the influence, was a chilling echo across 40 years, a warning that the true danger of the anomaly was not magnetic, but sentient. Weeks later, Dr. Lena Hansen stood on the deck of an icebreaker, the vessel holding its position at the edge of the Helheim Glacier's new, dramatically receded coastline. The Orpheus probe had been recovered, its data secured, and a global veil of secrecy had been thrown over the entire project. The official story released to the public was that the source of the Phoenix expedition's disappearance had been identified as a unique but natural geothermal and magnetic phenomenon. It was a necessary lie, a story to placate the world while a handful of people grappled with a truth that humanity was not ready for. The raw, biting wind whipped at her parka, but Lena barely felt the cold. Her gaze was fixed on the colossal wall of ice, the same glacier that had held the canister, the final message from Alistair Finch and Evelyn Hayes. She held a copy of Finch's logbook in her gloved hands, the physical artifact a tangible link to the 2 scientists she had chased her entire life. Their story was no longer a mystery, but a tragedy of heroic sacrifice. They had not been victims of the Arctic's indifference. but casualties and a first contact that no one had known was happening. They had faced a discovery beyond comprehension, and in their final moments had understood the profound threat it posed. Their last act was not to save themselves, but to warn those who would follow. The frozen canister was their legacy, a desperate attempt to keep a terrible secret buried, a secret that Lena and her team had now, with the best of intentions, unearthed. The implications of the subglacial structure, the tomb as the internal memos now called it, were a weight on Lena's soul. It was ancient, alien, and possessed an intelligence that could exert an influence on the human mind. Was it a dormant ship? A weapon? A sentinel? They had no answers, only a cascade of new terrifying questions. The rhythmic magnetic pulse they had mapped was not just an energy signature, it was the slow, steady breathing of a sleeping giant. Finch's final frantic warning resonated in her mind. The ice is the only thing keeping it contained, and now the ice was melting at an unprecedented rate. The protective blanket that had kept this entity separate from the world for millennia was disappearing. Lena thought about her own career, the long years spent in pursuit of scientific truth, the unwavering belief that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance. Now, for the first time in her life, she was not so sure. She had solved the puzzle of the Phoenix expedition, the question that had driven her since she was a young student. She had vindicated Finch and Hayes, given their sacrifice meaning, but in doing so, she had uncovered a danger far greater than a simple polar mystery. She had placed her hand on a doorknob that humanity was perhaps not meant to turn. The world of scientific exploration she had known, a world of geological certainties and measurable phenomena, had been shattered. It had been replaced by a world of cosmic horror, of ancient intelligences and warnings from the dead. As the icebreaker's horn sounded, signaling their departure, Lena looked out one last time at the vast, unforgiving expanse of white. The Arctic had yielded its secret, but in doing so, it had presented the world with a new and profound existential threat. The legacy of Finch and Hayes was no longer just a story of polar exploration. It was the opening chapter of a new story, one whose ending was terrifyingly unwritten. Lena Hansen, the veteran researcher who had set out to solve a 40-year-old cold case, now carried the burden of a secret that could change the future of the human race. The ice was still melting, and deep beneath it, something was waiting. The true mystery had only just begun.